Japan's leading car makers face uncertainty as US President-elect Donald Trump signals major policy changes aimed at revitalizing American manufacturing.
Japanese automakers are optimistic about the trade discussions between Tokyo and Washington. The two sides reached a basic agreement in late August.
But I just signed the largest trade deal in history. I think maybe the largest
America
deal
tried to save its car industry and instead slapped a boot on its own accelerator. While Washington bragged about bringing jobs home, Detroit's future is getting hauled across the border on a Canadian flatbed. Here's what you're going to learn today. The precise tariff math that turned U.S. factories into cost traps, how Subaru's Outback decision became the first domino, why Toyota and Honda doubled down on Ontario while shrinking U.S. exposure, the new split supply blueprint Japanese executives use to dodge policy whiplash, which Canadian cities are cashing the checks, how. This mirrors the 1980s Reagan playbook, and why your next oil filter, brake pad, or EV battery might quietly owe more to Ottawa than to Washington. By the end, you'll know exactly who wins, who loses, and why predictability, not patriotic slogans, now decides where North America builds its cars. Let's get into it. The silence came first. No pressers, no victory laps, just a quiet redrawing of maps and boardrooms from Tokyo to Toronto. The message between the lines was blunt. If the rules keep changing in the US, we'll build where they don't. For decades, Japan's automakers were the backbone of America's reliability, reputation. Toyota in Kentucky, Honda in Ohio, Nissan in Mississippi, Subaru in Indiana, feeding millions of American paychecks, dealerships, and suppliers. But when policy turns into roulette, even world-class operators start counting exits. The first public crack showed up in early 2025. Subaru's US boss confirmed what insiders had whispered for months. The Lafayette, Indiana plant would no longer build Outbacks for Canada. That volume shifted back to Japan because Japan's trade framework offered cleaner access to Canada than America did. It wasn't a sentimental move. It was math. 2 layers of 25% tariffs, one from Washington, one from Ottawa in retaliation, turned cross-border flows into a financial cul-de-sac. Imports from the US to Canada were slashed from roughly a quarter of Subaru's Canadian mix to barely a tenth. You can call it protection. Subaru called it unsustainable. Here's the mechanic's view of the tariff problem. Modern cars aren't made in anywhere, they're assembled from everywhere. Steel and aluminum prices set your baseline. Then come hundreds of parts, wiring harnesses, semiconductors, infotainment modules, catalytic components, sourced globally because no single country can efficiently make them all. When you stack tariffs on raw materials, then on parts, then on finished vehicles, you don't just bring back jobs. You multiply costs at every station on the line. The result, a car that should land at $30,000 arrives wearing a $40,000 price tag, and that's before the dealer even turns on the showroom lights. Executives aren't philosophers. They're risk accountants. They sat with their legal counsel, ran the tariff trees, and concluded there were only 3 ways out. 1. Accept the margin hit. Shareholders won't tolerate that. 2. Hike prices and hope customers swallow. Dangerous in a market already stretched by financing costs. 3. Reroute production and logistics around the policy minefield, quiet, technical, and brutally effective. Guess which one? That's why the map started tilting north. Toyota and Honda, already entrenched in Ontario, expanded hybrid and EV capacity where the rulebook looked boring, in the best way possible. Smaller badges, Mazda, Mitsubishi, Subaru, shifted logistics hubs, research pods, and regional leadership seats to the Toronto area. The pitch wasn't mystique. It was math plus momentum. Open trade channels through CPTPP, stable policy, a deep supplier bench stretching from Windsor to Montreal, and a workforce that's been assembling Japanese cars for 4 decades without political drama. If you want to see how quickly boring becomes a competitive weapon, look at Ontario's industrial map. Alliston and Cambridge rediscovered their swagger. Windsor, long tied to Detroit's heartbeat, synced itself to battery corridors reaching into Quebec's mineral belt. 7 major Japanese automotive plants anchor the region, 5 for light vehicles, 1 engine plant, 1 for trucks, feeding 30,000 direct jobs and many more in supply chains that do everything from stamped metal to just-in-time logistics. Japan's manufacturers have poured well over $10 billion into Canada across the decades. Now, that number is climbing because every new tariff skirmish south of the border makes a Canadian spreadsheet glow greener, and if you think this is new, it isn't. The 1980s wrote the prequel. Back then, the US slapped voluntary limits on Japanese car imports, functionally a massive tariff. Japan didn't rage, it invested. Honda opened in Ontario in 1984, Toyota in 1986. Vehicles built there flowed into the US without tripping the import wire. Economists dubbed Canada North America's industrial backdoor. 4 decades later, the door's still there. Only now it opens into EVs, battery materials, and software-defined vehicles. Let's talk about the split supply model, the quiet blueprint Japanese boards now favor. Keep high-value R&D and platform design anchored in Japan, where talent density and corporate memory live. Use Canada for final assembly and regional parts clustering, close to the US consumer, outside the tariff blast radius. Flex exports globally from Canadian ports using a spiderweb of free trade agreements. Net effect: avoid policy whiplash, stabilize margins, and deliver cars to US driveways with fewer tariff fingerprints on the invoice. Meanwhile, those same tariffs the US rolled out to protect domestic production started doing collateral damage. Tariffs on auto parts don't just hit finished vehicles. They raise costs for American plants that still rely on imported components. That pushes up sticker prices for domestically built cars and the service costs for parts you replace every year. The brake pads, the filters, the rotors, none of those negotiate with campaign promises. They just cost what they cost. The EV layer makes the divergence even starker. America talks reshoring. Canada plays resources. Ontario and Quebec sit on lithium, nickel, and cobalt corridors, pairing mining policy with battery plant incentives and grid reliability. Japanese engineering loves that kind of certainty. Planners can lock 10 to 15-year horizon charts without wondering if a tariff tweet will nuke next quarter's bill of materials. As EVs unbundle into batteries, motors, inverters, and software, modular supply chains beat nationalist megaplants every time. Let's scoreboard this shift. Winners: Canada's industrial towns and the provincial governments that bet on long-term, rules-based trade. Japanese OEMs that can keep North American sales without swallowing North American volatility. Consumers who value hybrid and EV reliability and don't care which side of the border final torque happens on. And yes, union and non-union Canadian workers who step into roles that would have been American if the rules had stayed steady. Losers: US suppliers whose margins depend on frictionless parts flow. Dealers whose floor plans suffer as prices creep and inventory mix gets constrained. American consumers paying more for the same metal or stepping down a trim level because their budget topped out. And US regions that thought tariff walls were moats, only to watch investment walk across a bridge that was always there. Now, let's deal with the obvious pushback. Aren't these companies still employing tens of thousands in the US? Absolutely. Toyota Kentucky, Honda Alabama, Nissan Tennessee, these aren't going anywhere overnight. But growth is the tell. Where do the new lines get stamped? Where do the next hybrid transaxles spin up? Where do the logistics hubs expand and the engineering teams hire? If the answer keeps tilting toward Ontario, you've found the future. Even if the past is still humming in Ohio, history's rhyme scheme isn't subtle. In the 80s, the US tried to box out Japan. Japan used Canada to step around the ring. In the 2020s, tariffs come back dressed as patriotism. Japan shrugs, redraws, and keeps selling cars to Americans who mostly shop on monthly payment, not on origin stories. Every time Washington turns the dial, the global supply chain learns a new dance step. The chorus hasn't changed: stability beats swagger. And it's not just Japan anymore. South Korean and European brands are following the same North-friendly playbook. Split supply, tariff-aware routing, Canadian final assembly, diversified export lanes. Toronto, long a finance town, is becoming an operations brain for export management. That's not a sizzle headline. It's a CFO's dream. You get US consumer proximity, but you manage your risk from a jurisdiction where rules don't swing with the news cycle. So, where does this go next? First, the Canadian bridge economy deepens. Battery plants scale. Mineral supply chains knit tighter. Software teams shadow physical assembly to speed model cycles.